My name is Isabelle Moore, and I'm 28. I stepped off the bus in the late afternoon light, my suitcase in hand and my heart hovering somewhere between hope and dread. The air smelled of salt and cedar, familiar, like the lullabies my mother used to hum while she packed my lunch. I hadn't walked up that driveway in 5 years, ever since college graduation whisked me to a city that felt, at the time, like my destiny. Now, jobless and bruised by layoffs, I trudged up the same cracked stone path I once skipped along as a child. Each footstep echoed in the hollow of my chest. Home, but not really mine anymore. The front door creaked open before I reached it. My father's eyes narrowed as he took in my tired face. He motioned me inside with a stiff nod, and I swallowed the lump in my throat. The living room looked smaller than I remembered. As if the walls had crept inward while I was away, photographs of my siblings smiling, perfect lined the mantel. I hesitated, then crossed the threshold, pretending I belonged here, where every glance felt like a judgment. Dinner that night was a study in cold civility. My stepmother set plates of roast and vegetables before us, and the conversation stuttered. Awkwardly, polite questions about my commute, my apartment in the city, my plans. My siblings laughed at inside jokes I no longer understood. My father didn't catch my eye once, instead. He sipped his wine as though he were watching a performance from a distant and I was the unwelcome understudy. I pressed my napkin into my hands and forced myself to swallow, wrinkle by wrinkle, the shame of having failed. I tried to stay small, to disappear between mouthfuls of bland food, but as the minutes ticked by, I felt something coiling in my belly, anger, sorrow, I couldn't name it. I watched my father's rigid posture, the way he leaned back in his chair and surveyed us like a general inspecting troop. His silence weighed heavily. A question I could not answer. What did I do to deserve this exile? The laughter of my siblings hit me like a wave, each peal a reminder that I was the black sheep, an afterthought in my own family story. When my father finally spoke, the tension snapped. He slammed his fork down so hard the tines bent. "You're a burden," he said, voice low but sharp enough to carve through the room. "Get out of my house." The words landed in the pit of my stomach with such force that for a moment I couldn't breathe. My cheeks burned and tears threatened, tears I wouldn't give him the victory of seeing. I stood up, clutching my napkin like a shield, and let the hollow silence fill the space between us. I walked out without a word, each step driven by a fierce, quiet resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The night air was cool against my flushed skin. Behind me, the glow from the dining room window was a shuttered eye, refusing to see me. I felt small, yes, but not broken. Somewhere beneath the sting of rejection, something else stirred. The first flicker of reckoning. 3 days before that dinner, I sat alone at my small kitchen table, the morning sun pouring through a half-open blind. My hands trembled as I unfolded the official envelope from Fairbanks and Holloway, the estate attorneys my mother had trusted. I'd almost tossed it into my overflowing recycle bin, thinking it was another bill or marketing piece, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the crispness of the paper, or the way my mother's name, Mary Ellen Prescott Moore, prickled at the top. I stared at the letterhead for a long moment, my heart thudding in my ears. My mother had died 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack that left me unmoored in a way I still felt. My father had dismissed her investments as worthless trinkets, and I believed him. I believed that anything she had left behind her, paintings, her journals, her dreams, were gone or sold off to settle debts. But this letter suggested otherwise. My breath hitched when I read the first line. "We are writing to inform you that the investment account held in the name of Mary Ellen Prescott Moore has matured, and you are the sole beneficiary." I pressed the letter against my chest, as though I could mine strength from its promise. A smile flickered in spite of everything, hope that maybe, finally, I wasn't as powerless as I'd felt these last months. I read on, the words blurring. As tears came, the balance was substantial enough to change everything. Then, at the end, came a note about real property. A beachfront cottage in Cape Willow. The one my father always insisted had been sold to cover school fees and taxes. But the paperwork said otherwise. It was still in my mother's name, unopened, waiting. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it sink in. I thought of that cottage, with its peeling turquoise shutters and the faint smell of salt that clung to its floorboards. I pictured my mother there, brushing sand off her bare feet, humming to herself as she watched the sunrise. It seemed like another lifetime ago now. Her world was calling me back. I didn't tell anyone that day. I folded the letter and tucked it into the worn pocket of my jacket. I went to a cafe, ordered a latte, and stared out the window at strangers hurrying along the sidewalk. Every face looked hopeful, frightened, determined like mine did. Just moments ago, I realized I felt all of those things at once. Fear that my father would try to take it. Hope that this could be my lifeline. Determination to hold on to it. No matter what. For hours I sat there, drafting emails in my head to the attorney, imagining conversations with my father that I wasn't sure I was ready to have. I planned every possible reaction, his denial, his anger, his smug insistence that I didn't deserve any of it, and I felt a fierce surge of resolve. I would show him, not out of spite, necessarily, but out of a need to carve out my own place in the world, one that wasn't defined by layoffs or his scorn. That afternoon, I walked into the attorney's office for the first time since my mother's death. I was a stranger to its mahogany furnishings and hushed corridors, but the moment I handed over the letter, I felt a shift inside me. The friendly paralegal smiled kindly as she explained the next steps. There would be paperwork to sign, deeds to transfer, notices to file. It was all so legal, so final. When I left, the sun was already dipping low, and I walked down the street lighter than I had in months. I carried a small stack of documents in my bag, but I felt something bigger in my chest. The stirrings of a new beginning, one I would earn with every signature I made. Later that night, I'd face my family again, and this time, I would have the truth on my side. That evening, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the envelope from Fairbanks and Holloway spread open on my lap like a map to an uncharted territory. The familiar scent of lavender from my mother's sachet lingered in the drawers, and I pressed my palm against the cool wood of her old dresser, as if touching it could summon her spirit. I felt a tremor of disbelief ripple through me. How had I gone so long believing there was nothing left for me? The numbers on the statement felt unreal. 6 figures, enough to rewrite the story I thought was ending. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, picturing my mother in that cottage she loved so dearly. I imagined her footsteps on the sand, her laughter carried off by the wind, and I felt a sudden surge of anger that my father had lied all these years. He had told me her investments were worthless, insisted the cottage was sold to cover lingering debts, yet here I was, the sole beneficiary of her life's quiet work. He had no idea what power I now held, no hint of the reckoning I was beginning to taste. In the soft lamplight, I read the letter again, letting each clause sink in. The investment account had matured 5 days ago, just days before he publicly declared me a burden. The property deed was clear. Mary Ellen Prescott Moore was still the legal owner, and I had the right to claim that ownership. I felt something shift deep inside me. A quiet flame of resolve that would not be extinguished. This had to stay secret for now. I wasn't ready to announce it at dinner, not until my plan was fully formed. I took out my laptop and drafted a list of immediate steps. Contact the attorney to confirm next procedures. Schedule a meeting to discuss filing the deed transfer. Research any liens or claims on the cottage, and prepare a contingency in case my father tried to challenge it. Each task felt like laying another brick in a foundation I was determined to build. It wasn't just about money or property, it was about reclaiming my worth, proving that I deserved a place in this family and in the world. My phone buzzed with a message from my friend Lena. Checking in on how I was settling back home, I typed a quick reply, tired but okay, and forced myself to smile before setting it aside. I couldn't share this with her yet. I needed to carry it alone until I knew I could see it through. Sitting there, I felt the weight of secrecy press against my ribs, but I also felt lighter than I had in months. The helplessness that clung to me since the layoff had finally given way to purpose. I stood and paced the room, hands clasped behind my back. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale stripes across the floor. Images of the cottage danced in my mind, its salt-stained windows, the creaking porch boards, the wildflowers that grew at the dune's edge. I could almost hear the ocean's hush and feel the breeze on my skin. That place had been my mother's refuge. It would become mine too, a sanctuary where I could breathe again. Before sleep claimed me, I gathered the envelope and tucked it safely under my pillow. It was more than paper, it was a promise of transformation. I drifted off knowing that when dawn came, I would move quietly but decisively. My father thought he had banished me. Thought he held all the cards. He didn't know that the game had already changed, and while he slept unaware, I would be taking the first steps toward the life I was meant to live, one far richer than he ever imagined. That morning, I woke before the sun. The house silent around me. My father's footsteps hadn't yet creaked down the hall, and my siblings were still lost in dreams. I lay in bed for a long moment, listening to the quiet rhythms of the old place, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint whistle of wind through the cracked window pane. Somewhere inside me, something was stirring, an echo of my mother's calm determination. I dressed in jeans and a plain white shirt, the outfit as unremarkable as I could make it. Subtlety was my ally now. I slipped the folder of documents from beneath my pillow and thumbed through the pages one last time. The attorney's letter, the deed, the statements, they felt heavy in my hands, but also like talismans. I reminded myself that until I chose to reveal them, they were mine alone, power I didn't have to share. In the kitchen, I poured myself a mug of coffee and stared out the window at the yard. The grass was overgrown, and somewhere a bird scratched at the feeder. The world outside this house was still turning, unaware of the quiet revolution I was about to launch. I took a long sip of coffee, the bitterness anchoring me to the moment. I wasn't the same person who had returned here days ago, trembling with shame and uncertainty. I had grown wings. I opened my laptop and logged into my email. A message was waiting from the paralegal at Fairbanks and Holloway. Let me know when you're ready to proceed with the deed transfer and account disbursement. I stared at her words, feeling the weight of their promise. I typed back, I'd like to schedule a meeting this Friday. Please let me know what time works. Then I closed my computer. One meeting would put all of this into motion. By 10 o'clock, I was out the door, driving past the salt flats toward the attorney's office. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with wisps of cloud. My hands gripped the steering wheel as though it were a lifeline. With every mile, the knot of dread in my stomach unwound, replaced by a firm resolve. I pictured my father's astonished face when he learned that the cottage he'd claimed sold was still and legally mine. At the office, the paralegal greeted me warmly, her kindness a stark contrast to my father's cold indifference. We went over the steps, affidavits to sign, filings to submit, potential objections we might face. I asked questions. What if Dad challenges it? What if someone else lays claim? Each answer stoked my confidence. She assured me that the paperwork was airtight. My mother's intentions had been clear, her documentation beyond reproach. Driving home, I felt a budding exhilaration. I thought of how I had spent years hiding my own strengths, shrinking myself to fit into the narrow roles my family assigned me. Now I realized that my mother's legacy wasn't just money or property. It was proof that careful perseverance could yield something real. That gift was hers, but it was mine to wield. When I pulled into the driveway, I paused before the front door. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the porch. I imagined walking inside with my head held high, documents in hand. I thought of showing my father the truth, watching him struggle to reconcile his words with reality. But I also knew I didn't need to stage an elaborate reveal. Power, I was learning, could be exercised quietly by completing each legal step, by claiming what was rightfully mine, by living my life on my own terms. I slipped inside and placed the folder on the kitchen table. Just out of sight, my father's car was in the driveway. But the house remained hushed. I poured another cup of coffee and settled into a chair, feeling the weight of the coming days. There would be tension, there might be anger, but I was ready. In the soft glow of the early afternoon, I allowed myself a small private smile. My mother had left me a legacy far greater than this cottage or the account. It was the knowledge that I was never truly powerless. And now I would use that inheritance not just to claim land or money, but to reclaim my own worth, piece by piece, in the place that once tried to bury me. I spent the next morning drafting messages on my phone as if my life depended on them, because, in a way, it did. First, I texted Lena, my oldest friend from law school. I didn't tell her about the inheritance. I simply asked if she could meet me for coffee to talk through a personal legal question. She replied almost instantly, of course. I'll be there in an hour, giving me a jolt of relief. Coffee at our favorite cafe felt both comforting and surreal. Lena arrived in her navy blazer, clipboard in hand. Every inch the capable attorney I knew she'd become. We ordered Americanos and sat at a corner table, the late morning sun slanting across our papers. I fumbled under the table for my folder, then slid it across to her. When she saw the Fairbanks and Holloway letter and the deed, her eyes widened just the slightest crack in her professional composure. "You're serious," she said quietly. Turning the pages with careful fingers, I nodded, my throat tight. "My father never told me she invested," I admitted. "He said everything was sold. He said I'd get nothing." I watched her, trying to gauge her reaction. Instead of shock or judgment, there was only fierce solidarity. "We'll get started right away," she said. "First step, make sure nothing can slip through the cracks." Lena and I spent hours outlining a strategy. She drew up drafts of affidavits, pointed out potential objections Dad might raise, and recommended a forensic accountant to verify the account balance and trace any attempted refinancing. Every suggestion built my confidence inch by inch. When she said, "Your mother clearly planned for this," her words felt like a benediction. I realized then that I was never alone. My mother's foresight and my friend's loyalty formed a hidden alliance stronger than any family betrayal. After coffee, I stopped by the local title office to confirm that there were no pending liens on the cottage. The clerk smiled kindly as he pulled the records. To quick searches later, he assured me the title was clear. I signed a confirmation receipt and left with my heart pounding. Each signature, each stamped form, felt like a small victory etched in ink. That afternoon, I sat at my childhood dining table ironically, the scene of my humiliation, and mapped out a timeline with Lena. By Friday, we'd file the transfer. By the following week, we'd have confirmation from the county recorder. She encouraged me to set up a trust in my name to protect the assets, and I made a note to research estate planning seminars as we worked. My stepmother's muted laughter carried through the next room, but I forced myself to ignore it. I was no longer shrinking myself to fit their narrative. By evening, I reached out to Charlie, the realtor who'd sold my mother's other properties. I explained that I was handling the cottage transfer and asked if he could recommend contractors for essential repairs once the deed was official. He replied with enthusiasm, promising to give me the best folks in Cape Willow. Even the task of repainting the shutters felt like reclaiming a forgotten piece of my mother's world. That night, I lay in my old bedroom replaying the day's progress, messages sent, meetings scheduled, form signed. I felt a warmth in my chest, quiet and steady, as if my mother's spirit settled beside me, nodding in approval. For the first time since I'd received that letter, I allowed myself to believe that I could see this through, that I could stand up to my father's cruelty with more than words. I drifted to sleep with Lena's plan and Charlie's contacts at my side. The house was still asleep, unaware of the alliances forming within its walls. When dawn came, I would wake knowing I had people in my corner, lawyers, friends, even strangers committed to righting the wrongs my father had set in motion. In that solidarity, I found strength. And in that strength, the quiet beginning of my reckoning. The morning light slipped through the curtains in pale slats as I stood in my childhood bathroom, brushing my hair. At 28, I'd always thought I'd have moved far from this room. But here I was again, wearing my old uniform of jeans and a soft sweater, hiding the storm of purpose inside me. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and slipped on a simple necklace my mother had given me. A silver seashell that felt like a secret talisman against the cold walls I'd come to know so well. I carried my coffee into the living room where my father was reading the paper, pretending not to notice me. I settled on the sofa with a polite nod, careful to keep my documents hidden in the tote at my feet. Conversation hovered at a safe distance. My stepmother's inquiries about my future plans. My siblings' chatter about summer internships. I answered in clipped sentences, my tone neutral, my gaze steady. I was playing a role: Isabelle, the grateful daughter, the family's prodigal child back from the city. But beneath that calm surface, my mind raced through the steps I'd taken. Earlier that week, I'd filed the notice of intent to transfer the deed. I'd confirmed the account disbursement schedule. I'd engaged the forensic accountant to double-check the investment records. Each quiet action was a piece of a jigsaw puzzle I was completing. Without their knowledge, they thought I was struggling, still grasping at straws. Meanwhile, I held the key to everything they'd dismissed. My father leaned forward, folding the newspaper. "So, you talked to your lawyer?" he asked, voice measured. I suppressed a smile and gave him the courteous version of the truth. "I did. We're meeting again on Friday to finalize a few details." He nodded, satisfaction flickering across his features. He believed this kept me dependent on an endless loop of meetings and paperwork. He didn't see how each appointment tightened the noose of my leverage around his complacency. Later that afternoon, I slipped out to run errands, post office, bank, grocery store, ordinary tasks that belied the extraordinary undercurrent of my life now. At the post office, I sent off the certified letter to the county recorder. At the bank, I approved the disbursement schedule. In the grocery store, I stocked up on basics for the cottage, imagining its kitchen shelves lined with fresh bread and jars of homemade jam. Each chore felt like practice for the day I would claim that space as my own. Back home, I cleared my documents from the table and replaced them with a novel I'd been reading. The illusion of normalcy was important. My father thrived on control, on the belief that I lacked direction. If I could keep him believing that narrative, he'd never suspect the foundation I was quietly laying beneath his world. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I received a text from the forensic accountant. All figures verified, no anomalies detected, you're clear to proceed. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders melt. I typed back a simple thank you and slipped my phone into my pocket. The house felt smaller now, its corners less oppressive. In the kitchen, my stepmother was preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and onion simmering in olive oil drifted through the air. I offered to help, and she gave me a frosty smile. You're welcome to chop the vegetables, she said, handing me a peeling knife. I nodded and set to work, my hand steadied. As I cut the peppers, I thought of all the times I'd been dismissed at this very counter, my opinions unheard, my ambitions belittled. Now, I stood here with sharpened focus, every slice a reminder of how far I'd come. The ordinary rhythm of chopping became a meditation, one cut for every doubt I'd ever had. Every cruel word my father had spoken, every moment I'd felt invisible. Later, I placed a simple plate of pasta on the table and sat down with my family. We ate in companionable silence, punctuated by polite conversation. No one spoke of the cottage, the inheritance, the letters in my tote bag, and that was just how I wanted it. I was learning that power could be wielded softly, like the slow turning of a key in a lock, unnoticed until the door clicks open. When I finally retreated to my room that night, I laid my documents on the desk and eyed them with quiet triumph. The small, incremental moves I'd made, filings, confirmations, meetings, had built an unshakable foundation. My father's world was still intact, but the ground beneath it was shifting. The reckoning I felt stirring inside me promised that the reveal would be inevitable, and when it came, there would be no denying my place in my mother's legacy, or my right to claim my own future. That Saturday morning, the cottage's nameplate arrived in the mail, a simple brass plaque engraved with Moore Cottage. I unwrapped it slowly, heart pounding, feeling the weight of my mother's legacy in my hands. The wind rattled the window panes as I studied the letters, imagining them gleaming in the sun above the front door. This small token felt like a declaration. I belonged here. I closed my eyes and pressed the plaque to my chest, drawing strength from its quiet promise. I spent the rest of the morning loading my car with tools and paint cans, preparing for the first wave of repairs once the deed was officially transferred. The trunk brimmed with brushes, rollers, and buckets of soft seafoam green paint, the color my mother had chosen when she first fell in love with the cottage. Each can bore the faint fingerprint of the hardware store, a stamp of reality on my dream. As I drove out of town, the salty breeze filling my windows, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. I was moving toward something, toward reclamation, toward healing. That afternoon, I returned to the attorney's office for the final signing. The paralegal led me into a quiet conference room, where the papers lay neatly arranged on the polished table. I took a deep breath and placed my hand on the stack. As I signed each document, transfer of deed, authorization of disbursement, certification of beneficiary, I felt my resolve harden. These signatures weren't just ink on paper, they were the final steps in a journey that had begun with shame and betrayal. When I signed the last page, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My mother's cottage was officially mine. Driving home, I rehearsed the moment I would share the news with my father. I imagined his face, frozen in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I pictured my siblings' stunned silence, the murmur of my stepmother scrambling for explanations. But when I pulled into the driveway, I hesitated. I didn't want theatrics. Power, I'd learned, was best exercised with quiet confidence, so I parked, took out my phone, and sent a text to Dad. I just finished signing the documents for the cottage. It's officially mine now. I'll start repairs next week. Let me know if you need to coordinate anything. I pressed send and felt a tremor in my chest. There it was laid out plainly. Without anger or flourish, the truth of my mother's legacy resting in black and white. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. Dad, what are you talking about? That cottage was sold years ago. His denial came swiftly, the first crack in his facade. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment I felt the old anxiety rise, the urge to shrink back into silence, but I reminded myself of the countless times I'd rehearsed this. I crafted my reply with care. Me, I have the deed, signed today. Fairbanks and Holloway handled it, you can verify with them. I'm planning repairs starting Monday. I hit send and set the phone aside. I poured a glass of water and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The house was silent, but somewhere inside me, a storm was gathering. I knew he would call the attorney. He would accuse me of fraud. He would try to bully me into relinquishing what was rightfully mine. But I also knew I was ready. By evening, my phone lit up again with messages from my siblings. Confusion and concern mingled in their texts. My stepmother called, voice pitched low with disbelief. I answered calmly, walking through my plans for repairs, budgets, timelines with each word. I felt the tremor in my voice steady into conviction. I wasn't asking permission, I was informing them of a fact they could no longer deny. Later that night, I sat on the porch of the family home, gaze fixed on the dark horizon where the ocean whispered beyond the dunes. My heart ached with the memory of my father's plate-slamming cruelty, but it also swelled with quiet triumph. I had moved from victim to architect of my own destiny. The cottage, once a symbol of neglect in my father's eyes, had become my beacon. I closed my eyes and felt the sea breeze on my cheeks, carrying echoes of my mother's laughter. Tomorrow, I would take the first brushstroke to the shutters. Tomorrow, I would walk through rooms that belonged to me. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply feel the hollow ache of long-buried pain mingling with the steady glow of empowerment. For the first time in years, I felt whole. The next morning, the sky was overcast, a soft gray wash that matched the tension I felt in my chest. I woke early and poured myself a cup of tea, settling at the kitchen counter with my phone. Alerts lit up the screen. Missed calls from Dad, a message from the county recorder confirming receipt of my deed transfer, and a text from the forensic accountant assuring me that my father's attempted refinancing of the cottage had no legal stand-in. Gee, the weight of it all pressed in on me, but I met it with a calm determination. I knew what I'd done and why, and I knew where I was going. Before the sun fully rose, Dad called. His voice crackled through the speaker, edged with indignation. I've been in touch with Fairbanks and Holloway, he began, and they tell me there's a mistake. They've contacted me directly. You really think you can just steal what isn't yours? I closed my eyes and drew a steadying breath. This was part of the plan. Let him sputter, let him rage. My mother's documents were airtight, but his fury was real, and that, I thought, could begin to crack the armor he'd wrapped around himself for so long. Dad, I said quietly, I have every piece of paper you need. I can send you copies right now. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on his end. Copies, he repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time. You're sending me copies of a deed that belongs to you now? Yes, I said, lifting my chin, and you can verify them with the county. I didn't give him a chance to interrupt. Instead, I recited the recording number, the clerk's name, the date and time of my filing. I could picture his face growing pale with each detail when I finished. I laid my phone on the counter and let the silence fill the space between us. He finally stammered, "This isn't over." I agreed, "No, it isn't. We'll see each other in court if you insist." Then I hung up, my heart thrumming with adrenaline and something deeper, vindication. The line went dead, and I set my cup down with a quiet clink. I spent the rest of the morning gathering more documentation, mortgage statements showing his unauthorized refinancing, the trust agreement that forbade such transactions without my consent, and the email chain with the accountant. I organized everything into neat folders, each labeled with a date and a brief description. It felt oddly ritualistic, like preparing offerings for a long overdue confrontation. At midday, I stepped outside and walked down our block, the familiar sights of summer children riding bikes, neighbors pulling weeds acting as a counterpoint to the storm I was brewing at home. I found a bench in the park and sat, pulling the first folder into my lap. I reread the trust agreement, every legal phrase anchoring me in the certainty of my mother's intent. She had been meticulous, deliberate her final act of care for me. I pressed my palm against the paper as though I could draw strength from her foresight. Returning home, I steeled myself for the family meeting that Dad had demanded over text. He'd insisted we discuss this face to face. Though I suspected it was a prelude to more accusations, I set the folders on the dining table and texted him, "I'll be there at 6. My stepmother peeked around the corner, curiosity and wary apology in her eyes. I offered her a gentle nod and returned my attention to my paperwork. At 6, Dad arrived in a stiff suit, his posture rigid as I invited him to sit. My siblings hovered by the doorway, their expressions unreadable. I opened the first folder and slid it across the table. "Here," I said, voice steady, "the trust agreement. Signed by Mom in 2018. It names me as sole beneficiary and prohibits any refinancing without my signature." His hand trembled as he reached for the pages. I watched him scan the signatures in silence. When he looked up, his eyes were full of something I'd never seen there before, genuine fear. "But how did you find this?" he whispered. I leaned forward. "It was in the attorney's files. You never disclosed it." "Dad," my words weren't an accusation, just fact. I moved on to the next folder. Revealing the county recorder's confirmation, "My deed is registered. It's yours only if someone proves otherwise." He swallowed, closing his mouth against any retort. Sensing his defeat, I stood and gathered my folders. The room was still, my siblings exchanged glances, and even my stepmother seemed bereft of words. I realized then that the quiet power I wielded was more than legal. It was the truth laid bare in black and white. I tucked the files into my tote. "That's all," I said softly. "I suggest you review these thoroughly. I won't ask again." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked out, leaving the house in a hush of stunned silence. Behind me, I felt the weight of their shock and the swift, unspoken shift in our family's balance of power. I stepped into the evening air, my chest light, my resolve unbroken. The reckoning was well underway. I didn't plan to make a spectacle of it, but that afternoon's meeting became the reckoning I'd longed for. I arrived at the family home carrying the last set of documents, court filings, certified mail receipts, and the forensic accountant's report. The air was heavy with humidity and anticipation. My father met me at the door, his suit jacket hanging awkwardly over his frame. His eyes a mixture of anger and something like fear. Behind him stood my stepmother and siblings, their faces taut with curiosity. I felt my heart beat steadily in my chest, the rhythm a quiet drum of resolve. We gathered in the living room, where the photo of my mother smiling on the mantel looked down upon us. I placed the folder on the coffee table and took a breath. My voice was calm, but beneath it was the fierce pulse of every humiliation I'd suffered. The dinner table row, his words branding me a burden, the years of his disdain. "I gave you every opportunity to resolve this quietly," I began, "but you insisted on denial." I unfurled the report, its pages crisp with the accountant's letterhead. "Here is proof of the refinancing you arranged without my knowledge or consent. You used Mom's trust as collateral and never told me. That's fraud." My father's face went pale. He looked as though he might protest, but my siblings' wide eyes and my stepmother's pinched mouth held him back. I moved to the next exhibit, the certified receipt from the county recorder. "And here," I said, tapping the paper, "is the confirmation that the deed to the cottage is officially in my name. Every requirement was met. There is no legal basis for your claims." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. In the room, my brother cleared his throat. "But Dad said he sold the cottage years ago. He told us it was part of Mom's debt payoff." His voice trembled with uncertainty. I met his gaze and said, "He lied to you. The proceeds from that sale never existed. He used the cottage's equity for his own purposes. And he hid it from all of us." My siblings exchanged shocked glances, their loyalty shifting in the space between us. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then spoke in a low, measured tone. "Isabelle, he began, but I cut him off gently. "I'm not here to argue your motives. I'm here to state the facts. The law is clear, the documents are clear, and my rights are clear. You have until next week to reverse the refinancing, or I will file a civil suit." His shoulders slumped, as though the fight had drained out of him. In that moment, the imperious figure who had driven me out of his house was reduced to a man confronted by irrefutable truth. My stepmother rose, her eyes glistening. She approached me cautiously and murmured, "I'm sorry you've been hurt." The apology was quiet, but it resonated with more honesty than any of my father's grand declarations. I nodded and met my sister's eyes. "No more secrets," I said softly. "This family deserves better than lies." She reached out and took my hand, her grip warm and real. I realized then that the fight had never been against my father alone, but against the years of erasure of my mother's legacy, of my own worth. With that final confrontation, I reclaimed both. When I stepped out onto the front porch later, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, bathing the house in a golden light. I felt a release, as though I'd exhaled a lifetime of pain. The reckoning had come not with shouting or dramatic spectacle, but with quiet certainty and unshakable proof. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of blooming jasmine drifting from the garden. Tomorrow, I would begin renovations on the cottage, transforming it into a place of memory and hope. But today, I allowed myself to simply stand in the glow of what I'd accomplished. I had faced the betrayal, confronted the injustice, and emerged stronger, no longer a burden, but the rightful architect of my own story. Sunlight danced across the freshly painted porch as I turned the brass key in the cottage door for the first time. The hinges gave a familiar creak that felt like an old friend greeting me home. Stepping inside, I inhaled deep salt and cedar mingling with fresh paint hand for a moment. The weight I'd carried all these months lifted. The living room still wore my mother's touch, the original hardwood floors, the built-in bookcase she'd installed one summer afternoon. I ran my fingers along the worn banister, remembering her laughter echoing up the stairs. Now, as I traced the grain beneath my fingertips, I felt her presence bolstering my courage. This place was ours again. Boxes of supplies lined one wall, stacks of new curtains, tubs of sand-colored paint, and a pile of old family photographs I'd rescued from the attic. I settled on the floor and began arranging them. Mom at the cottage window, Dad teaching me to fish, my siblings building sandcastles. Each image felt like a prayer, anchoring me to the past even as I built my future. I carried a framed photo of Mom into what had once been her art nook. A corner by the window where light spilled in every morning. I set it on a small side table and smoothed the cloth of the lampshade. In that quiet spot, I could imagine her sketching the dunes, humming softly as she worked. I sat beside the table and closed my eyes, letting her memory fill the room with warmth. Outside, I heard the sound of gravel crunching and looked up to see my father on the porch steps. He stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. For so long, he had been the source of my pain. Now, in this gentle morning light, he seemed smaller somehow, human in his regret. He cleared his throat. "Isabelle," he said, voice softer than I'd heard in years. I met his gaze and waited. He swallowed. "I'm sorry for everything." No excuses, no defensiveness, just those two words. I felt the tension in my chest ease and I nodded. "I've reclaimed this place." I replied quietly. It was always more than bricks and boards. It was her sanctuary. My voice cracked on the last word, and I looked away. He stepped forward, handing me a folded piece of paper. "I had this drawn up," he said. "I thought you might want to finish the plans for the guest wing." He offered a small smile that felt like an olive branch. I unfolded the paper too. Fine sketches of a tiny guest bedroom, its windows overlooking the dunes. My heart fluttered. This was the cottage I remembered, with rooms my mother dreamed of. I thought of forgiving him, not because he'd earned it, but because holding onto anger would only keep me from moving forward. I placed the sketch next to my mother's photo and traced the lines with my fingertip. Over the next hours, we worked side by side, measuring walls, choosing paint samples, laughing as we struggled to hang shelves straight. My siblings and stepmother arrived later, each offering help moving furniture, sanding floorboards, planting wildflowers in pots. The laughter that filled the cottage was different now, honest and warm. No undercurrents of judgment or fear. By sunset, the cottage looked more like home than it had in years. Soft lanterns glowed on the porch and inside. The gentle hum of conversation drifted through open windows. I stood in the doorway, watching my family with new memories on the threshold of the past. I felt a quiet swell of pride, not just in these walls, but in the journey I'd taken to reclaim them. That night, I lay in my mother's old bed, the sea breeze rustling the curtains. I closed my eyes and listened to the cottage breathe around me. I felt whole, forged by betrayal, strengthened by truth, and guided by love that had outlasted deceit. Tomorrow the work would continue, restoring floors, hanging curtains, filling the guest room with fresh linens. But tonight, I simply rested in the promise of what I'd built, a home defined not by my father's cruelty, but by my mother's grace and my own unyielding hope.